Notice how this verse said, no one claimed that any of his possessions was his own. Now, it is important to note that this right here is not a biblical command. The early church's generosity is worthy of our emulation, but we are not required to completely imitate the practices that we are seeing today. God is not telling us through Scripture that if you have a brand new bass boat, that bass boat is also mine and I get to take it to the lake this week, okay? God is not telling us that if you have a freezer full of grass-fed ribeyes, that those ribeyes are also mine and I get to stop by your house today, grab some, and take some home to grill for my family tonight, okay? But that would be awesome. But the radical acts of generosity we are seeing from the early church were not mandated. It was done voluntarily and it was motivated by love. But we do have to know that, as we see with the early church here, is in this passage, and as our big idea says, is that God does desire for his people to be a generous people. The exact acts of generosity from the early church aren't required to be emulated, but their spirit of generosity should be emulated. And this passage today shows that shows us that the early church, they were united, they loved one another, they sacrificed for one another, and they practiced a rational generosity with one another. They weren't a selfish congregation. They were a sharing and generous congregation. And why did they do this? It's because the generous God of the entire universe had touched their lives so deeply, they couldn't help but practice a rational generosity. They knew what Christ had done for them. They knew that they were once sinners that stood in opposition to God. They knew that they were once bound by death, as we talked about on Easter Sunday, and on the way to hell. But now the generous, loving, sovereign God made a way for them to be saved when they and you and I did not deserve it. And they also knew that God was sovereign and was the one that was ultimately the owner of all things. They knew that all of their possessions ultimately belonged to God. In Job 41:11, God said this, "Who confronted me that I should repay him? Everything under heaven belongs to me." Regardless of if people submit to God, he is the master and owner of all things. And the early church knew this. And it was why they didn't claim their possessions as their own. And it's why they shared in all things. It's why they weren't selfish. It's why they practiced radical, irrational generosity. They shared everything. They didn't hold on to things so tightly. They didn't hold on to their possessions so tightly. They didn't hold on to their money so tightly because they knew that everything under heaven belonged to who? God. R.C. Sproul once said, "Everything we have comes from his hand. So how could we possibly be anything but cheerful givers?"